So now I'm just going to introduce our keynote speaker, Wendy Bellion. Wendy Bellion is an associate professor of art history at the University of Delaware. In spring 2015, she is the Terra Foundation for American Art Museum professor and chercheur invité at the Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art in Paris. She is the author of Citizen Spectator, Art, Illusion, and Visual Perception in Early National America, which was awarded the Smithsonian's Charles Eldridge Prize for outstanding scholarship. She is also the co-editor of Literature Portfolio, special issue exploring objects in motion in early North America. She has lectured and published widely on 18th and 19th century American art, and she's currently completing a new book about iconoclasm and historical memory in New York. And she is going to give a lecture today about performing iconoclasm, which I think fits very well with what we just discussed and the theme of destruction in art in general. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you, Hélène. I want to echo the thanks to both Alex and Hélène for a really superb symposium. I'm very much looking forward to the presentations tomorrow as well. And my thanks too to the Courtauld Institute and to the Terra Foundation for inviting me to be here. It's a real honor. So my talk is going to present something of a departure from the presentations this afternoon because it takes a long view of art and destruction from the late 18th century to the late 20th century. That said, I hope it also offers something of a capstone to the talks this afternoon because you're going to see that there's a bit of burnings, a bit of bogs, a bit of limbs, reenactment, and even street action. Sadly, I have no meat to offer you. Work that in. Primarily, though, as my title suggests, I'm going to be talking about iconoclasm as a mode of destruction, and in particular, teasing out its ritualized and performative dimensions. This painting offers an excellent starting point for these issues. Completed in 1939 by Grant Wood, the picture stages an iconic act of destruction as theatrical spectacle. In the foreground appears the figure of Mason Weems, also known as Parson Weems, as you can see by the title. Weems was a historian, the first historian, in fact, to chronicle the life of George Washington, and as such, the first to engage a myth about Washington's life. Namely, that as a child, Washington chopped down one of his father's beloved cherry trees. When confronted with the evidence, Washington confessed and famously said, "I cannot tell a lie. I did it with a hatchet." It's really hard not to say that in a demonic voice. Now, parents today might have responded with a shriek and a timeout. But apparently, Washington's father was far more forgiving because he embraced George and declared that his honesty was worth 1,000 cherry trees. Now, Weems popularized this story, he probably even invented it, in order to demonstrate Washington's virtue, and his strategy worked. During the 19th century and into the 20th, the story attained the status of a national myth, one that worked to prove the integrity of the founding father, and by extension, the moral character of the country that he led. This, then, is both the premise of Wood's painting and the scene he represents in the middle ground, where young George explains himself to his father. Now, we could probably spend all evening dissecting this one image alone, for it's a very, very fascinating image. Note that Washington, for example, sports an adult head. It's from Gilbert Stuart's Athenaeum portrait of President Washington, the same head on the $1 bill. And note, too, that George and his father are not the only people present. Against an improbably organized hillside of plantings, a man and woman of African descent collect cherries from an intact tree. The fact that their labor is naturalized as part of a mythic landscape at once implicates and excuses Washington as a slaveholder. What's most interesting, though, within the parameters of this symposium is the way that Wood frames the cherry tree legend using the device of the curtains and the figure of Weems. In this role, Weems may remind us of Charles Wilson Peele's self-portrait, where Peele raises a red curtain onto a view of the Philadelphia Museum. But if Wood is nodding toward Peele's famous picture, his painting enacts temporal and spatial ambiguities that are absent from the earlier image. For example, it's possible to see a spatial contiguity here. That is, Weems appears to pull back a curtain to reveal another picture that represents the cherry tree story. Alternatively, we may understand Weems in his role as historian, bridging the past and the present. In pulling back the curtain, he invites us to look back through linear time, as if through a portal or a Renaissance window, to witness the precocious iconoclast fessing up to his actions. Or third, we may interpret this composition in theatrical terms, recognizing Weems as a showman and stage manager. Here, he pulls back the curtains to reveal not another picture, nor the distant past, but rather a present-day reenactment of the very story that he made famous. What the picture offers in this reading is history as performance. It suggests the capacity of theatrical reenactment to bridge the colonial past and the modern present, the power of reenactment to sustain myths of national founding. Understood in this way, Wood's painting points us toward other reenactments of colonial history in the 20th century, especially ones that revisit moments of violent upheaval and destruction. More specifically, it compels us to ask what it means to re-perform iconoclasm, and indeed to perform iconoclasm itself. For one of the ideas I'd like to argue here is that iconoclasm is often also self-consciously enacted. My case in point concerns an episode in the history of nation-making, every bit as epic as the incident of the cherry tree. Namely, the destruction of a huge, gilded, lead equestrian statue of King George III in New York City during the outset of the American Revolution. The statue was commissioned by New York's Colonial Assembly in 1766 to honor the King's support for the repeal of the Stamp Act, one of the first parliamentary taxation acts to excite widespread protest in the American colonies. And what you're looking at here is an early 20th century drawing that reimagined the statue's appearance. Notably, the sculptor was Joseph Wilton, an artist with important connections to Somerset House. Wilton was a founder of the Royal Academy. He was also the sculptor in ordinary to George III, and carvings from his workshop can be seen around the outside of the court hall, including the heads of river gods on the Strand side of the building, and several allegorical figures representing the 4 continents on the first story above the courtyard. This one is America. Wilton designed the statue of George III after the famous sculpture of Marcus Aurelius on the Capitoline Hill. It arrived in New York in 1770 together with a marble figure of William Pitt the Elder that Wilton had also modeled. Pitt had championed colonial rights during the Stamp Act debates, and he was a great hero to the Americans. The Pitt statue was installed at the corner of William and Wall Streets, in the heart of what is today Wall Street's financial district. You can see that it is also without a head and arms, which it lost during the American Revolution. The equestrian statue was placed upon a tall pedestal in a park called Bowling Green, at the very southern tip of Manhattan. And you've heard of this park, even if you haven't been there, because in 2011, it was the place where the Occupy Wall Street movement began. This is the first image that the Canadian magazine Adbusters published in calling people to occupy Wall Street. It suggested that protesters meet at the iconic sculpture of Charging Bull, often taken to be an emblem of Wall Street. And it is the sculpture that you now encounter coming down Broadway at the head of Bowling Green. The attack on the royal statue occurred on July 9, 1776, several days after the Declaration of Independence was ratified in Philadelphia. After gathering uptown at a public space called the Commons, a crowd of colonial soldiers and sailors moved to Bowling Green, where they tore the figure of the king from its pedestal and hacked it into pieces. Most of the statue was carted away to a military depot in the adjacent state of Connecticut, where it was melted down and reshaped into tens of thousands of bullets for the American Army. Nearly as soon as the statue came down, however, Americans began putting it back up and pushing it back over again and again and again. The statue's destruction inspired over a dozen 19th century visual representations, including prints, postcards, and paintings. This one by an immigrant German artist named Johannes Ortel had the longest staying power. The early 20th century would bring proposals for a new equestrian statue of George III at Bowling Green to replace the one lost in 1776. And in turn, these proposals were met with angry suggestions for a counter-monument representing a crowd tearing the statue down. A sort of memorial to iconoclasm, if you will. The events at Bowling Green also inspired performances. Two plays produced shortly after the Revolution made reference to the destroyed statue, and during the 20th century, the organizers of civic pageants and parades began staging reenactments of the destruction. In 1909, a grand city festival called the Hudson-Fulton Celebration featured a parade with floats representing episodes in New York history. One of those floats, as you can just about see in this photograph, included a model of the equestrian statue with actors in colonial costume. About 2 decades later, in 1932, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel hosted an elaborate ball organized by a group called the Society of Beaux-Arts Architects. The theme of the party was Old New York, and the guests included elite New Yorkers descended from founding families of the city. Garbed in 18th century dress, they performed a series of tableaux vivants, revisiting colonial history, including once again the act of iconoclasm at Bowling Green. And my thanks to Jason Hill for obtaining this image for me at the New York Historical Society. A third reenactment occurred as recently as 1976 outside New York in the town of Wilton, Connecticut. The name is a coincidence. There's no relation to Joseph Wilton, but the town was significant to the history of the equestrian statue. When the parts of the destroyed statue were being transported through Connecticut for melting, colonials loyal to the king made off with large fragments, which they buried in fields, bogs, and under the floorboards of houses. In the bicentennial year of 1976, Wilton residents marked their role in this history at their 4th of July parade, which included this reproduction of the statue, which was conveyed through the streets and beheaded. In the book project from which I draw this talk, I'm asking how this very eclectic body of visual and theatrical representations continually made and remade cultural memories of iconoclasm, place, and nation. In particular, I'm interested in how such representations turn the assault on the king's statue into a creation story for New York City, and to a lesser extent, this very small town in Connecticut. With these ideas in mind, let me turn to the ways in which performance structured and mobilized many of these representations. And then I'll turn to consider one of the 20th century reenactments in some detail, the Hudson-Fulton celebration. I'd be happy to take questions on these later reenactments at the end of my talk. Throughout, I want to suggest how iconoclasm, which we often regard as sheer destruction, in fact possesses a deeply generative power. Performative rituals gave meaning to the royal statue in Bowling Green at just about every point in the life of the monument. Rituals of space, movement, and sound not only predated the statue's destruction, but I would argue helped to create the very conditions that enabled New Yorkers to tear it down. To discern these rituals in the historical record, we have to look backward from 1776 and outward beyond Bowling Green to the geography of Lower Manhattan. From the Commons, where colonial protesters had raised a series of what were called liberty poles, they were large ship's masts, and they were raised in celebration of English civil rights. It was a straight shot 1 mile downhill along Broadway, the city's busiest, widest thoroughfare, to the equestrian statue at Bowling Green. From this tiny park, it was a short walk northeast to Pitt's statue on Wall Street. Together, the two statues and the Liberty poles mapped a roughly triangular field of political signs. Bowling Green, which you see here in modern view, was the oldest of these sites, and in many ways, it was where New York began. For the Dutch, it had been a town center. For the English, it was a space of genteel sport. People literally bowled here. It was also the imperial heart of the city. Fort George and the English battery commanded the southern tip of the island. The colonial governors lodged within the garrison walls. The centrality of Bowling Green made this site the logical start point and end point for civic ceremonies as well as civil protest. In October of 1753, for example, a large procession in honor of a new colonial governor began at the fort and marched north along Broadway until it reached the City Hall on Wall Street. Just over a decade later, in October of 1765, a crowd angered by the Stamp Act reversed this ceremonial route, surging south from the Commons to the British fort to protest the tax. The following night, it retraced its path with even greater urgency. Setting out from the Liberty Pole, a large group of men arrived at the fort with effigies of the devil and the despised Lieutenant Governor, Cadwallader Colden. Reaching the fort where Colden was nervously holed up, the protesters shook the gates before regrouping at nearby Bowling Green, where they demolished the governor's carriage, built a massive bonfire, and fed it with the effigies. And what you're looking at here is a study for another float in the Hudson Fulton celebration, which celebrated these protests at Bowling Green. You can see the devil. He's holding a boot. It's a reference to Lord Bute, the Scottish advisor to George III. And you can see that Colden is represented as the rebel drummer of 1745. It's a reference to the fact that as a child, he actually served under Bonnie Prince Charlie in the Scottish uprising of 1745. Bowling Green was thus a ritualized and vexed political space well before the statue of the king went up on its pedestal in 1770 and came down in 1776. The presence of the statue ensured that this space would continue to be contested. Regally towering atop a pedestal, the sculpture quite literally put a face on the British Empire. Indeed, it remade the public space of Bowling Green into a New World Place Royale, a place of imperial display. The civic rituals performed during the statue's dedication, rituals that were annually repeated on events like the King's birthday, reified the symbolic presence of the statue. When dignitaries gathered to celebrate the statue's installation in 1770, the event was loud with noises both human and non-human. The assembled crowd paraded in a circle around the statue. They toasted the health of the king, listened to a band, and witnessed a discharge of 32 cannon fires. Everyone expressed approval with loud acclamations of joy, according to one observer. And let me emphasize that nothing quite like this had ever occurred in New York City, and yet it was utterly unoriginal. The ceremony that transpired at Bowling Green followed customs that had been performed at the dedication of royal statues many times before in early modern Britain and France. Just a few years earlier, in 1763, Parisians had thrown a 3-day party to unveil Bouchardon's equestrian statue of Louis XV. Officials paraded to the monument, circled it 3 times, saluted the figure, and cried, "Long live the king." Sound is especially important here as a constitutive element of social ritual. And on this point, it's worth noting that the statue in Bowling Green was effectively mute. The right arm was raised. It might have held a truncheon following Roman traditions, or it was extended in a classical adlocudio gesture, a traditional gesture for an orator. Either way, it implied a forthcoming address from the monarch to his colonial subjects. But at the same time, this was an object designed to appeal to the eye, not to the ear. It was elevated on a pedestal 15 feet above the ground, above the prattle of ordinary pedestrians. And it was gilded, so its surface gleamed in sunlight and in torchlight. The statue was surely the brightest thing in the colonial landscape, and it impressed through scale and visibility. Mum as it was, though, the statue formed part of larger performative soundscapes, organizing spaces of imperial belonging and colonial resistance. For example, on royal anniversaries and political commemorations, the British residents of New York fired a very specific set of gun salutes around the city. In a pattern of call and response, these salutes began at the Commons, they were repeated at the fort adjacent to the statue, and they resounded again at the Commons. These sound marks, as historians of sound would call them, recharged the monuments with political meaning. On such occasions, the monuments doubled as sonic nodes, marking places of ritual significance. Paul Connerton's idea of the performative utterance as something that creates place, that gathers and constitutes community, is quite important here. Performative utterances can be gestures and movements as well as sounds. The reproduction of such utterances at the King statue made Bowling Green into a place firmly identified with English authority. Years before the statue was toppled then, it was firmly embedded in a culture of rite and ritual. This is equally true of the statue's destruction. We can't fully know what happened on the night in July of 1776 when a crowd assembled at Bowling Green to pull the statue down. Nor can we fully recover the maelstrom of fury and elation that empowered the group to dismantle the sculpture. In other presentations of this material, I've suggested that we need to pay much more attention to the affected dimensions of iconoclasm, much more than is usually given. I think we can ask, for example, simply, what does it feel like to be part of a large crowd destroying a material thing? What we can say is that this act of iconoclasm loosely followed a cultural script. It reproduced European, and particularly English, practices of material destruction that had been in place for generations. Some of these practices will be familiar to local members of the audience, thanks to a Tate exhibition called Art Under Attack, Histories of British Iconoclasm, that took place here in 2013. In the exhibition catalog, the Tate curator Greg Sullivan underscored the ritualized nature of iconoclasm, observing that similar patterns of action are discernible across the history of destroyed statues. In 1689, for example, a crowd in Newcastle pulled down an equestrian statue of James II. It beat the figure, dragged it through the streets, and then tossed it into a river. Such actions, Sullivan added, often inverted the very rites that attended the dedication of statues. Both of these observations help account for what transpired in New York. The dedication of the statue had involved an organized series of marches, music, and speeches, an approach to and around and away from the pedestal, during which time the statue was admired in daylight from a respectful distance. The assault upended this behavior. It involved a nighttime swell of people up and at the pedestal, whoops and hollers and cheers, the clank of tools against metal, the dispersal of the parts on the ground. Scholars have suggested that this attack on the statue of George III, like the violence visited upon the statue of James II, amounted to symbolic regicide. And to be sure, there's a measure of truth to this, but the figure of the king was assailed in a manner that suggested the desecration of a real human body. One man pounced upon the trunk of the king, scratching at its skin to remove flakes of gilding. The limbs of the figure were dragged through the streets in the manner of a common criminal. The statue was also decapitated, recalling the fate of the Stuart king Charles I. Some wanted to impale the head on a stake, as if to suggest treason. Instead, it was sent back to London as proof that the Patriots meant business. And it was last spotted in the 1780s rolling around under someone's sofa. If anyone knows where it is, please let me know. We can also sense something of the persistence of English rituals in the treatment of the large fragments that were transported to Connecticut and seized by Loyalists. When they absconded with the surviving pieces of the statue, Loyalists made a point of burying them. Well before 1776, Europeans did the same thing. A short walk away from here in Charing Cross, you can see Hubert de Seur's 17th century bronze statue of Charles I. It was supposed to have been destroyed following the king's death, but instead it was buried by a sympathetic royalist who misled authorities to believe that he had melted it down. It was then triumphantly reinstalled following the restoration. Similar actions occurred in Paris during the 1790s, when the statues of French kings were pulled from cathedrals, beheaded, and buried. Let me come back to Bowling Green to make one further point on the subject of ritual and iconoclasm. This one has to do with urban space and cultural memory. I mentioned earlier that on the occasion of the Stamp Act protests in 1765, crowds moved south from the Commons along Broadway to Bowling Green, where they seized and burned the carriage of the ranking British official. In 1776, the crowd that attacked the royal statue retraced the exact same route. On the afternoon of July 9th, the Declaration of Independence was read aloud to George Washington's troops, who were gathered uptown at the Commons. The Declaration had listed 26 grievances against George III. Later that night, a group swarmed down Broadway to Bowling Green and tore the statue down. Contemporary New Yorkers saw a direct cause and effect between the public reading of the Declaration and the statue's destruction. And this is important to emphasize because we can and should understand the Declaration itself as another kind of ritualized performance, the performance of a speech act. Taking a broader historical and geospatial view, we can also see how those actions of 1776 were located in the processional landscape of 1765, namely the movement of radical protesters down Broadway and the occupation of Bowling Green. In the years to come, all that would remain in Bowling Green was the pedestal of Joseph Wilton's statue. Some New Yorkers reimagined this ruin itself as an abstract memorial to the Revolution, an accidental cenotaph. Others proposed repopulating the pedestal with statues honoring the new George in power, namely George Washington. And that's the impetus behind the publication of this engraving from 1798. The detail here shows you the pedestal still standing in the park. Such appropriations and surrogations would seem to bring this history of iconoclasm to a close. And indeed, some scholars have interpreted the destruction of the king's statue as an instance of damnatio memoriae, the practice dating to ancient Rome of trying to erase the cultural memory of a deposed leader by displacing or destroying all symbols of his existence. Yet, as many have argued, iconoclasm is not wholly or even principally an act of erasure. Joseph Kerner has observed that the things that iconoclasts assail seldom disappear. Indeed, and I quote, "they persist and function by being perpetually destroyed." James Simpson has similarly described iconoclasm as a kinetic cycle that continually produces new things for destruction. Both Simpson and Kerner were writing in this context about the Protestant Reformation, but their observations are equally relevant to the actions that destroyed the King statue in New York, and to the modes of representation from the visual to the performative that these actions continue to generate right through the present day. The statue of George III never really went away. It lived on in the form of large fragments that were recovered from Connecticut and returned to New York museums, including the tail of the horse at the center. And its destruction was represented by a number of painters and printmakers. And here's just a sample of several of these images. They range from the perspective view in the upper left corner to an engraving after Ortel, to periodical illustrations and even a postcard. And I'll be looking closely at these fragments and images in chapters of my book, and in so doing, I hope to engage an excellent question that Erica Naginski has posed, and to which Hélène also referred in her opening remarks. Nijinsky writes that depictions of iconoclasm offer, and I quote, an exegesis on negation that is paradoxically visual in nature. She then poses, how does the representation of destruction work exactly? In my remaining time, I'd like to put a version of that question to one of the 20th century performances that I've introduced to ask simply, how does the reenactment of destruction work exactly? In the case of the Hudson-Fulton celebration of 1909, this question would seem to have a straightforward answer. For although the event promised a reenactment, no statues in fact came down. The celebration itself was the grandest civic party that New York had ever thrown. The ostensible motive was to commemorate 400 years of city and state history, starting with 1609, when the English explorer Henry Hudson sailed up what was then called the West River. The event also commemorated 1809, when the American Robert Fulton navigated the same river in his brand new invention, the steamboat. Appropriately, the celebration commenced with a lavish naval parade on the Hudson River. The festivities then moved on to land for another 15 days in Manhattan, the outer boroughs, and the state capitol, further north in Albany. The events included speeches, concerts, exhibitions, and even carnivals. The event that revisited the destruction of the Bowling Green statue took place within the form of a day-long parade that meandered over 100 city blocks, south from the Upper West Side to Washington Square Park. It had to be big because it was supposed to survey 4 long periods of settlement and growth, namely the Indian, the Dutch, the British, and the American. Precisely how to represent this history was a matter of considerable discussion. The organizers considered whether to hold a theatrical spectacle in a contained space, like a park, or whether to make it mobile, like a parade. The result of these debates was a compromise, a historical parade of, quote, moving models and living tableaus. However, paradoxically, the parade would feature stationary scenes on mobile platforms. Now, today we simply call these things floats. But in 1909, New Yorkers had a rich lexicon for describing the visuality of these constructions and the objectives of the parade. The moving models and living tableaus were also called scenes and pictures. The point was to teach history by means of visual instruction through a structure of visual unfolding. The sequential nature of the parade lent itself to this idea of an unfolding. The parade was linear in a temporal sense. As you can see in this program, the floats followed a chronological presentation. But it was also linear in a spatial sense. The procession moved from north to south in one long line. This linearity imposed a rational logic on the past, making it visually legible for the thousands of spectators who crowded the streets. Promotional materials worked to reify the sense of historical order. This pamphlet, for example, gave each float a name, a description, and a clear place within the parade. And here's the text, unfortunately a bit hard to read for the float of the King's statue. The parade organizers also illustrated the floats in the form of vignettes. Here again, the King's statue on the left. And they even marketed souvenirs in the form of postcards so that spectators could take a piece of the parade home. Such ephemera ensured a longevity for the Hudson Fulton well after the event had ended. At least that was the primary idea. One pamphlet advised, and I quote, that to derive lasting benefit from a historical standpoint, the scenes, while still fresh in the mind, should be studied in some history. I'd like to take a closer look at the use of those terms, scenes or tableaus, because they really go to the heart of how reenactment works in this case. By 1909, tableaux vivants had been popular features of civic festivals for decades in the United States, and a much longer history in Europe. They involved costume participants enacting the roles of figures from canonical paintings, sculptures, literature, and history. They were intended, in other words, to conjure up something familiar, something recognizable, something already represented. Moreover, they were designed to be still. In this regard, the tableaus of the Hudson Fulton were, properly speaking, stagings rather than reenactments. They operated on the logic of immobility rather than action. This helps to explain a few things about the float of the Bowling Green statue. Although all of the texts for the float narrate an act of destruction, as in the caption to this postcard, in all of the photographs I've located so far, nothing is ever destroyed. Photographs from the parade show a group of costumed men standing around the base of a reproduction statue that represents some version of the lost original. You can make out ropes around the statue, which several of the men hold, and the fence around the base has been constructed to look bent, as if trammeled. And here's a view from another angle that shows much the same thing. In both, the statue is upright and undamaged. All of these details also appear in the postcard, which in turn closely resembles a watercolor study for the float that I found at the New York Historical Society. The one major difference, though, is that in the postcard and the study, the statue is already leaning over as if coming down. Unlike the photographs, these other images predict a destruction that has commenced but is not yet complete. And notably, this is precisely what appears in so many 19th century images about Bowling Green. Hence, it's likely that the designer of the Hudson Fulton float looked to visual precedents such as the one that you see here. During the heyday of tableau vivant, publishers circulated catalogs that illustrated suggestive scenes for performance. In this example, the destruction of the king statue features prominently. And, as in the Hudson Fulton postcard, the statue is under assault, but not yet pulled over. One conclusion we can draw from this succession of images is that the Hudson Fulton float was as much a response to a century of visual representations about iconoclasm as it was any kind of reenactment of the events of 1776. In other words, there's a genealogy of depiction that explains the float's appearance in 1909. The history it conveyed through the streets of New York was as much a sedimented history of images, an art history, as it was, well, any kind of history. I spoke before about the power of ritual in iconoclasm. Here we can, I think, speak about the power of visual convention. Still, it's worth observing that in the end, what the float presented was not destruction, but rather a failure to destruct. Maybe those costume performers tore down the statue at the end of the parade to mark what was surely an exhilarating and exhausting day. And maybe no photographer was standing nearby to snap a picture. But for the long duration of the parade down Central Park West and Fifth Avenue, what spectators witnessed was neither iconoclasm nor its aftermath, but rather its before. Not destruction, but rather its becoming, its unfolding. At some level, the organizers of the Hudson Fulton celebrations sensed that the scenes, which they had already described in all the promotional materials they had printed prior to the event, would not quite match the reenactments on the streets of New York, because they tried to deflect critiques of the tableaus by underscoring just how difficult it was to achieve mimesis. One critic suggested that this was only achievable on the stage of a theater, not in a pageant on wheels, and he even dismissed the floats as, quote, ambulatory specimens of Coney Island sculpture. People in 1909 understood this, in other words, as a problem of realism. In retrospect, I think we can approach the problem differently, as a problem of temporality. I already suggested that the float did not so much represent or reenact iconoclasm as reimagine what happened at Bowling Green before the statue came down. So there's a temporal disjunct in what the statue purports to represent, what the float purports to represent. In addition, the float confounded assumptions about the linearity of historical time. As we've seen, each float was supposed to follow a chronological sequence. So the destruction of the king statue in 1776 was meant to follow an event of 1775 and precede an event of 1777. But this is not what happened. The floats got out of order. And here you can see, in fact, that a model of a colonial house is following the statue float. This was supposed to have come many floats earlier. Some critics took glee in these errors. One writer mischievously noted, and I quote, that the student of history who might have depended upon the floats for instruction would have had his ideas of the early course of events on Manhattan sadly mixed. What he suggests, to take his remark a little more seriously than he surely intended, is a confusion of time itself, a mixture produced within the space between intentionality and enactment. The performance theorist Rebecca Schneider encourages us to see such disruptions productively, and I'll acknowledge that Schneider's work has really shaped my thinking on this issue. For Schneider, reenactment carries a creatively interruptive power. She argues, quote, that any time-based art encounters its most interesting aspect in the fold. The double, the second, the clone, the uncanny, the againness of reenactment. Schneider adds that sometimes it's the inadequacy of the copy that is most telling. As in a historical parade out of sequence, or a statue that defies its own doom, time, she says, plays forward and backward and sideways across the imagined community of an otherwise spatialized national plot. What, she invites us to think about, does time drag along through its structures of reenactment? These points bear particular consideration within the broader context of the Hudson Fulton, but this was not only a time when tableau vivants of the American past were popular, but when Americans were very willingly looking backward, trying to drag the past forward. It was a time, in other words, of colonial revivals. And this is a very, very big subject, and I'm only going to gloss it in the most general of terms. But in a nutshell, the late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of numerous groups who identified themselves as guardians of historical culture. These groups were composed of what has been described as the genteel or hereditary elite. Their goal was to shore up American traditions against a host of perceived threats, from industrialization and commercialization to the growth of immigration and the laboring classes. They sponsored new museums, libraries, historical societies, and civic pageants. They sought to promote ideals of beauty, education, and as the historian David Glassberg has put it, the vitality and picturesqueness of their own Anglo-American Protestant history and customs. The Hudson Fulton celebration fell squarely within these ambitions. One member of the New York elite explained that the event would benefit the native population of the city, meaning white New Yorkers, because they were, quote, more concerned with the present than the past. The benefit, he added, to New York's foreign-born population was obvious. I've been calling attention to what the float of the statue failed to accomplish. But this man's comment begs the related question of what it did achieve. Why did Americans resurrect King George in 1909, only to suggest they would pull him down again? Well, for one, the Hudson Fulton Parade occurred during a period of heightened self-consciousness about New York's contributions to the revolutionary past. For decades, the destruction of the royal statue had been represented as a starting point for American independence, one conceivable starting point among many possible ones. Locally, it can be understood as the city's version of the Boston Tea Party, something that allowed later generations to pinpoint the genesis of an American New York, as opposed to a Dutch New York, or a British New York, or even a Native American New York. Iconoclasm in this scenario was quite literally a tipping point, for it marked New York's entree into the Revolution and conveniently demonstrated the city's patriotism. And I'll simply add, this was a really tricky thing to do because New York was in fact a loyalist stronghold, both during and after the Revolution, and it was occupied by British troops for the duration of the Revolutionary War. Another way of answering what the Hudson Fulton float accomplished, however, is to underscore again that the reproduction statue of George III remained standing. Despite the assurance of destruction, despite those ropes lackadaisically held by the reenactors, an icon of British colonial rule stayed intact and visible on the city streets. And here I think the tableau vivant's logic of stillness carries a really resonant double meaning. The statue is quite literally still there. We have to consider how this non-destruction signified within an early 20th century culture anxious about demographic change and the growing racial and ethnic diversity of New York City. Scholars have recently emphasized the persistent Englishness of the post-revolutionary United States. In many ways, white Americans continue to model their culture on British practices and values. The reappearance of the royal statue well into the 20th century begs us, I think, to consider a much longer trajectory of Anglophilia. By pulling the statue down, whether actually in 1776 or imaginatively in later decades, Americans marked their political independence from Britain. But by keeping it up in 1909 and later decades, they reified certain social hegemonies. Schneider has observed that reenactments occasion a return to something unresolved. Her examples concern Civil War reenactments, which some participants say they are fighting again to win a war that they feel is still not over. In the case of Bowling Green, what's unresolved is not the outcome of the American Revolution, but rather processes of local and national self-definition. Iconoclasm is a powerful force in this process because it entails destruction as well as reinvention, a continual out with the old and in with the new. Moreover, its reiterative representation presupposes a destruction that is always already underway. For all the stillness of the tableaux vivants in the Hudson-Fulton celebration, there was a much longer historical motion at work. There's every indication that this process is still ongoing and in ways wholly novel and appropriate to a new century. The hottest theater ticket in New York City today is for a show called Hamilton. It's a rather unlikely success because it tells the story of America's founding fathers, in particular the rise and fall of the brilliant young statesman Alexander Hamilton. What makes this show so exciting, though, is the fresh way in which it's presented. The founding fathers and founding mothers are all portrayed by actors of color, and the lyrics are written in rap. Lin-Manuel Miranda, who you see at the far right, the brilliant young author and star of the show, has explained why he wrote and cast the play in such a novel fashion. He has said, quote, "It's the story of America then, told by America now." Miranda's observation could just as well describe the motivation behind the perennial reappearance of George III in American culture. Even now, millennial Americans have a new way to experience the Bowling Green iconoclasm. Uptown from the theater in which Hamilton is appearing, the New York Historical Society has installed an enlarged, digitized version of Ortel's painting. But where the 20th century reenacted this scene as a still life, the 21st sets the events into motion. By walking back and forth and waving their arms in the air, especially the Jedi Force move in the lower right here, visitors can trigger sensors that activate the image. For school groups, the drama culminates with the statue crashing to the ground. Now, what's notable in part about these images is that they show groups that are racially and ethnically mixed. These are today's New Yorkers. By reenacting through new technologies a story of America then, they are mobilizing iconoclasm to remake America now. Thank you.